Hi, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see nice turnout of people here today. And I'm pleased that most of us are still wearing masks. I think COVID is probably almost gone, but I think let's stick to the rules as we go along. I want to start off by saying a great thank you to Lulu and Mike for the last newsletter. Again, it was a fantastic edition. It's really full of stuff, really nice. Thanks for all the work that you guys put in. And also for the boxes and boxes of plants that are outside, for all those of you that are bringing and swapping. It sounds like this is going to be something we have to do regularly. As I mentioned, there are a couple of boxes of books there. We're selling them really cheap because I'm getting tired dragging the boxes around. In the newsletter, you guys all read about our show in autumn. A show like that needs a lot of effort. And if there's anybody who's willing to help, even with a little kind of job, please talk to us. And if many people get involved, it just makes it so much easier. We're going to do quite a few things differently this year to last year. Try out a few things, do things better, try out. Anyhow, you will see as we go along. Then last month I mentioned it, and I also did in the newsletter, that we want to have outings, getting out of Joburg. And I think I need to get some feedback from our members and guests who is interested in going out for weekends or for longer. Okay. Who is interested in a week?
Yeah, I think the week matters.
There's an invitation to a farm belonging to Norman and Gail Andrews. It's in the Eastern Cape. They've got 5 kilometers beach frontage. And they want us to come because the area has not been botanized and there must be amazing stuff out there. But to go all the way to the Eastern Cape, only worth it if you're going to do a week. And obviously en route, we'll go past Obesa nurseries and places like that. So it should be great fun. But I want us to form a little WhatsApp group for the people that would want to go. And that group then does its own organizing, find out what time of the year to go and get all the logistics done.
No idea when it will be.
So far, no, we want to first find out who's interested and then get those people together. Shorter weekend trips, particularly if it's a longer weekend. There's one trip which we'll probably do in spring, which is to the Lechalemetse mountain. That is near the Wolkberg Wilderness area, Mount Agatha, but we'll be coming not from the Zanin, the Lowveld, but we'll be coming from the top and going into the mountains. That trip we'll be doing with Rolf Peckover, who is an authority on Plachastelmas and Xeropegias. So that'll be great. And there are quite a few other places. There's Ntendeka, there's Malinoche in Swaziland, phenomenal place. We just don't go out, but those places they need best a long weekend, not just a normal weekend. So, but there, I think what we'll do, we'll just form little groups and make a decision, say when there's a long weekend, what we can do. Okay, I think that's enough from me at this stage. Today's speaker, Lulu was the one who made contact and arranged everything for us. So Lulu, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm not usually in front, so it's an unusual one. A couple of years ago, when I was writing a newsletter article on the Knaarvlakte and another one on the effect of the fog on the West Coast and another one on etc. You know, I always try and go to the original literature, and a name that kept on popping up was Dr. Ute Schmiedel. You can hear she's a German, and I'm a German, so I can pronounce the name correctly. Dr. Ute Schmiedel. And I thought, my goodness, she really must be an authority on the field. So I wrote to her many years ago in German nochal, saying to her, if she ever comes to Joburg, she should tell us beforehand and maybe we can, you know, have her speak. And of course, that was before COVID times. So at those times, we didn't do Zoom, we didn't do Facebook, we just did in person. And she very politely answered, yeah, I don't actually fly over Joburg. I fly to Cape Town and then I take it from there. So I just dropped it, and I thought we'd never have her speak for our society. But that's changed because, like so many other societies, we have now changed to be in person, but also online. And for that reason, we were able to ask Dr. Schmiedel, Ute Schmiedel, to talk to us tonight. So just a little bit of background. I won't bore you with it. You can see on the screen that she is at the University of Hamburg in Germany, in the Institute of Plant Science and Microbiology. She did her master's degree on the Knarsvlakte, and then she did her doctorate degree on various quartz fields in the west of our country. And so I reckon she knows the west of our country much better than I will ever know it. And I'm really, really very jealous, because I've actually never been to the Knarsvlakte, and I've never walked a quartz field. It's on my bucket list. So Dr. Schmiedel, Ute, thank you so much for the time that you've given us. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us and sharing your experience and your expertise. We're really looking forward to it. And can I give the microphone to you? You need to switch on your mic.
Yes, thank you, Lulu. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We can, thank you.
Is it fine? All right.
Yeah. All good.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure. And I think that's one of the few positive things about the pandemic, is that we learn how to communicate with each other in a different way. I think it's very nice to be in present with people, but I mean, for me, not flying around the world, particularly in the face of climate change, I think it's great. And to be able to talk to you like this, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I will talk about the ecology of Mesembs in Southern Africa, as Lily already introduced. And before I first I have to get this PowerPoint started. Okay, do you see the next slide? Just to confirm. All right,
Yeah,
I assume. Okay, very good. So before I start with the actual topic, I would like to explain a bit more why Mesem research in Hamburg, which might be a bit weird. And it has a long-standing tradition. Already just Gustav Schwantes, who was an archaeologist, but also very interested in succulents, started collecting Mesems at that time from Deutsch Südafrika and now it's Namibia, where he got his seeds from in the very early times of the last century. So he was the first, maybe, who started collecting and studying Mesems in Hamburg. He moved to later on to Kiel, where Dr. Ehlenfeld at that time, and later Professor Ehlenfeld at Hamburg University, actually got to know the collection, the Mesem collection, and got interested in this group. And that's how he started studying Mesems at Hamburg University, and with him then also Heidi Hartmann, and later Norbert Jürgens, who is actually my working group, my team leader, or my working group leader at University of Hamburg since 2000. So he was more interested in the ecology than in the phylogeny or the taxonomy. And with him, we started this, or I started with him to study the ecology of these Mesems. So that's how paths sometimes go, not direct, but there is some continuity in it. What do we do when we are in the field? Among others, we study vegetation change. So we have long-term plots, marked plots, which we revisit every year and document the vegetation and how it changes over time in response to climate parameters and land use. Then we are also interested in population dynamics. So we monitor even individual plants, measure them, and so on fixed plots. but we also collect for phylogenetic studies, for instance, as this photo shows. We are interested in the drivers of species composition and species distribution. And for that, we have weather stations in the western part of southern Africa, and you can find the data on saskalweathernet.org, where you can search the data, download data for various stations. Unfortunately, not in the eastern part of southern Africa, so Johannesburg is not part of it. But for the other parts, have very nice data to be used for free. Then we are interested in soil. So we study the soil, particularly as driver of species composition in space, and then land use as an important factor that influences species distribution and species composition. We're very fortunate to have an herbarium at Hamburg, Herbarium Hamburgense, which has 1.8 million herbarium specimens, and not all, but several of them, many of them are from South Africa or Southern Africa, many type specimens, at least, parts of the types, and many Mesembs, obviously. Then we also have a live plant collection, which is very important to us. Many of the collections go back to the early times of Ihlenfeld in the 50s, 60s of the last century, which is very important for teaching and for our research. So one of my core research interests are the quartz fields in Southern Africa. And I started with my research on it in 1993 when I did my master thesis on the vegetation. And I'm still fascinated by this habitat type and still continue studying it with, say, a mess. And but the question is, what characterizes these quartz fields? So if you look here, you can see they're densely covered by white quartz stones, and the plants that are found on the quartz, they're particularly small, they're tiny, much smaller than the plants of the surrounding vegetation, you can see, for instance, and which represents here the normal vegetation. And if you go closer, and for that we often have to go onto our knees, squat down, and then we can see how the quartz fields look like and how the plants on it look like. Tiny little fellows among quartz stones. That's Ophytum nanum, and here Aguroderma deletii. And the question is why the quartz field flora and vegetation differ so strongly from the surrounding, and how the vegetation changes over time, and how the plants cope with the land use, climate change, and other threats. And that is what drives my interest in the quartz fields or in my research. But first, where do these quartz fields occur? This is a map of Southern Africa with the biomes, which you know pretty well. And when we look at that and look at the distribution of the area, the sites with the highest density on quartz fields in Southern Africa, then we find they are mainly in the succulent Karoo. But not only, they do also occur in parts of the Namakaroo, in the Bushmanland, here in the Wambad area of southern Namibia, and the Pofadder region, as I call them, in southern Africa. And both are, the Namakaroo and the succulent Karoo are arid areas with low rainfall, but the main difference is that the difference in seasonality. So as you know, succulent Karoo is winter rainfall region, Namakaroo is summer rainfall region, both with very low rainfall. But what's important for the succulent Karoo, and that is an important aspect for the, also an important component that certainly drives the species composition of the quartz fields, is the high reliability of rainfall in the succulent Karoo. And that is how it looks like if it rains properly. In the succulent grew, everything is wet and it's a dense, it's like a curtain of rain, which is produced by a deep pressure system that provides soft rainfall that can last for hours and sometimes, if we are lucky, even for a few days. And this rain soaks everything, plants, soil, in the field. And so this way it is very efficient. So it's because it's so soft and it's so long and long-lasting event, the rainfall has more time to penetrate the soil. And so we have comparatively much less runoff than, for instance, in the summer rainfall region with a heavy rainfall storm. Another important source of humidity is the fog. Here, a photo of a foggy area that the fog develops over the cold Benguela current along the coast and moves inland for many kilometers, and that provides a very important source for humidity for the plants. Thirdly, the dew, which is actually the precipitating humidity of the water that's stored in the warm air, and then at night, and particularly in the early morning hours when the surfaces reach the lowest temperature, then the air humidity precipitates on the surfaces and then also runs down into the soil. The succulent Karoo vegetation in general is dominated by leaf succulents, as you know, and if you're lucky, then you will find after a good winter rainfall season, then you get a lot of annuals, Asteraceae, Scrofulariaceae, Fabaceae that cover the gaps of the vegetation among the plants. And the dominant and the perennial vegetation is shrubs like this Antimima here, leaf succulent mesem shrubs, or this Myrophytum myri in flower. Bulbs are also very important, not all of them, but several are also succulent like this Lacanalia. But in between, there are these quartz fields that of different sizes. Some of them are tiny, others can be huge, and they are surrounded by the zonal or normal vegetation. And sometimes they look like islands, and they're surrounded by the normal vegetation, like islands surrounded by oceans. Sometimes it's also the other way around. As far as you can see, there are quartz fields. This is a landscape in the Knarzflakte. We call it the moon landscape. And the zonal or normal vegetation is an exception, as you can see here. It's only along the low-lying areas. Quartz fields have very distinct boundaries surrounding vegetation. As you can see here, on the left-hand side is a quartz patch or field, and on the right-hand side it's a zonal vegetation, and it's one can actually draw a line here and say, okay, that's the boundary, which is quite unusual for vegetation. It's normally there are gradients between vegetation types. The quartz cover and the species composition of quartz fields is often very homogeneous. Typically, there's one species that dominates the vegetation here, the Cephalophyllum spicum. It's this here, and that is a Conophytum subfinistratum. It's also among it. But then you get also the vegetation at sites that are very diverse and very heterogeneous, and that's particularly the areas with the rocky, where you have rocky outcrops and in between little plant pots, various different types of plant species in the quartz fields. There are about more than 140 plant species that are obligate quartz field dwellers, so that only can be found on quartz fields. And 80% of them are local endemic. And if I say local endemic, then I don't mean they're endemic to South Africa, but they're endemic to one of these regions and often only a part of it. So with all these different colors indicate areas that have a distinct flora of quartz hills, and that's why I call them floristic regions or phytochoria. And even though the flora is very different and often originates from completely different lineages of mesembs, they look very similar to each other, and and within one genus they develop different growth forms like these. But if we compare it with this flora, for instance, here from the Little Karoo, we find again, even though it's a completely different lineage in the mesembs, again the same type of growth forms. So there seems to be the convergent evolution of the same architecture types within the different mesem lineages. So we have the flat ones, like Ageroderma deletii or Gibeum nociforme. We have the Ageroderma subalbum, quite branched and small leaves. We have Gibeum petrense with the same architecture from the Little Karoo. Then we have Ageroderma crateriforme, little branched and big leaves, the same with Gibeum heathii and the Little Karoo. Then branched with longish leaves and a bit more shrubbish, the Ageroderma fissum in the Knersflagte and Gibeum pubescens as an example from the Little Karoo. So there seem to be strong drivers that they're responsible for this adaptation of the different species to different parts of the quartz fields, and so do the same thing in evolution, in adaptation to these environments. And I would like to show you a few species from the different regions so that you then get an idea of the similarity. So I'll start with the Bushmanland, Warmland region, in the summer rainfall region. There, for instance, with Mesembs. And interestingly, that plant germinates underneath stones. So this is a gap that emerged when I lifted a stone. And this little green dot here is a seedling of Dentoranthus microspermus that benefits from the protection of the stone. The stone is translucent, so there's sun. There's enough sun that goes through the stone, but it protects the surface of the soil from evaporation. From the soil evaporates or precipitates on the lower surface of the stone and provides humidity to the plant. They keep on growing. This one is now about the size of a penny, but still flat. And then they become three-dimensional and start pushing off the stone. And finally, we find them among the stones and growing like a proper plant as we would expect them, what we would expect them to do. And then another species, Lapidaria margarete, was from that area. Richtersveld species are, for instance, the Cephalophyllum regale here in full bloom, or Chirodopsis herrii, or Conophytum hyans. Then the next, further to the south, a floristic area is Ritois vallecrae, which is actually nowadays part of the Namaka National Park, most of it, which is very nice. So it's protected by the park. It's, for instance, Myrophytum globosum here during the dry season. The leaves are completely dried out, and the thick body here is the leaf bud, or the bud of the leaves of the next, and that's how it looks like and when it rained nicely and the leaves are fully developed, the plant is in bloom. Cuniphytum concavum is one of the quartz field dwellers and specialist for that Rito-Israel area, very flat one. And if it's in the dry season, that's how it looks like during the growing season. And in the dry season, it's very difficult to spot, and you're lucky if it flowers so that you can find it. Then Knersflekte is certainly one of the, or it is definitely the biggest, the most important quartz field area in terms of size of the extension of the area where quartz fields occur, and in terms of the species richness that is that occurs in the Knersflekte on the quartz fields. There are even certainly several genera that are quartz field endemics in the Knersflekte. One very important and prominent one is the Agroderma species, genus Agroderma, with the species, for instance, Crateriforme, Agroderma pearsonii, Deletii ringens. Not easy to tell them apart, and genetic studies also showed they are not as clearly distinguished as we might want, but yet, so we can somehow tell them apart. Another genus that is endemic to the Knersflekte quartz is Ophytum with two species, Nanum and Oviforme. Here, Nanum with a dense stand in flower in the late afternoon sun. And that's the other species, Oviforme, which is a bit more egg-like, egg-shaped, the leaves. And that's the second species of that genus. And Dactylopsis digitata would be the third genus that is endemic to the Knersflekte on quartz, but unfortunately it has been sunk into the Mesembrantumum. Now it's Mesembrantumum digitatum, but for the sake of endemic genera, I like to keep it Dactylopsis. So, and it's, by the way, one of the few species in Mesembs that have alternate leaves. And these are alternate leaves, and there is no space for the flower, and only if the leaves start wilting and tip over, then there's space for the flower to get out, and then they produce these weird flowers. That is in actually in early summer or late spring, and that's how it looks like during the dry season. Here, the little stems and the fruits after the flower. Mesembs and quartz are not always only very compact, but they can also be branched and shrubby-like, like many of the Dicrocolons and this Dicrocolon humile from the Knersflekte. And they often form dense patches that are easily distinguished here from other species by the red color. Monilaria is also another genus that is restricted to quartz, and many of them are in the Knersflekte, Monilaria chrysoloica. It's in Afrikaans, it's Bobbejaan finger, as you can guess. The two fingers look like a baboon fingers, very thin and long. And another very interesting little fellow from the Knersflekte is Phalobolus abbreviatus, or now Mesembrantumum liliputanum. It has a little stem with a few leaves, which are deciduous, so they're dropped in the dry season as the flower. So there is actually nothing left from the plant during the dry season, and it looks like a little stick somewhere, and it's almost impossible to find it if it doesn't have leaves or flowers. Just to remember, there are not only Mesembs, there are many other fascinating genera and families, on quartz, like pelargoniums. Several pelargoniums occur on quartz fields, are endemic and restricted to quartz. Crassulus, Asteraces, and but this is Pelargonium caroli henrici, together with Phalobolus congestus or Mesembrantumum flavidum in flower on the quartz fields in the Knersflekte. several conophytums restricted to quartz fields like Conophytum minutum pearsonii from the Canary selector. This is how it looks like during the dry season. Then at the beginning of the rainy season, when the temperature drops and the first rainfall occurred, then Conophytum minutum starts flowering. And that's how it looks like during the growing season. Conophytum calculus, another fellow from the quartz flora of the Canary selector. Here, also in late autumn, when it starts flowering, that's how it looks like during the growing season in August, for instance. There's little brown spots here. That's part of a fruit. And maybe the most amazing little fellow from the little karoo is Diplosoma leucophyae, a little plant that is very, very soft, very gentle, and it easily, it's protected, it grows among stones, and you can squash it easily. It's very difficult to touch it without squashing the leaves. And it also completely disappears during the dry season. So one can wonder, if one looks at these quartz fields, why are there so many different species specialized on quartz fields? And the answer to that is quartz fields are not just quartz fields. There are many different habitats on quartz fields. So we're mistaken if we think that if we know quartz fields, we know quartz fields. There are many different habitat types there. So the question is, what are the drivers of these different habitat types? So if I look here, this is a photo from the Canary selector many, many years back. Certainly, you can see here 1996 when I took the photo in September. That is, I was here fascinated by the different habitat types or vegetation types that take turns here in the space. And I was wondering what drives it? Why is here seemingly no plants? Here there's quite a dense stand of a plant, and here it appears to be empty again. So, and this with very sharp boundaries. So what is going on up here? And first of all, we have to admit that it's not empty. There are a lot of plants. There's a very high density of plants, of Ageroderma deletii in this case. Very difficult to spot, but all these little light green, gray-green plants, silvery plants, that's where the name comes from. They're silver skin, so to say, are plants. So, and in front here, it's a different species. It's Dicrocraton, that we called at that time Pseudonodosum, most likely a new species, according to Ehlenfeld. And so the question is, why is it these sharp boundaries, and what is the difference between this one and that one? So, and I looked at the soil chemistry of the two sites and compared, and what I found is that, okay, in terms of pH, it's not that much of a difference. It's pH 5.7 and here pH 6.1. Okay, that's only 0.4 pH different. But if you look at the electrical conductivity, expression of salinity in the soil, then there's quite a strong decrease from there to here, and to the soil surface and the quartz cover on top. There's much lower density of the quartz gravel, that means 6 centimeters and bigger than on this habitat or in this vegetation type, with 50%. So there are differences between them, and these differences even appear in a very short distance. I started from the beginning. I started off with looking at the vegetation, and when I did that, as we do as vegetation ecologists, we go inside directly into the vegetation unit proper, as far as possible away from the boundaries in order to avoid edge effects. So I mapped my vegetation here and I mapped my vegetation there. And here I found, okay, there are a lot of, in growing season, a lot of annual mesembs, Mesembrantumum fastigiatum. And here it's a shrub, mesem shrub, Orisia butoni. And I looked at the soil, and it told me that Mesembrantumum fastigiatum is more on neutral soils with high salinity. It's very saline, it's 4 millisiemens per centimeter. And so I called this saline quartz fields, and then Orisia butoni was on acidic soil with a pH of 3 to 4.5 and low salinity, much about 1.5 microsiemens. It doesn't matter, the units don't matter, but it's much lower. And I call this acidic quartz field. So there are two extremes along a gradient of quartz fields. So I have acidic and saline quartz fields, and some stages or gradients in between. And I understood this, but then I was wondering at one stage, what is happening at the boundaries? Why, if I understand that this is very acidic and the other one is very saline, and what happens at the boundary? So I got, lucky enough, two very capable and motivated bachelor students, which is about some honors, from Hamburg University, who studied these boundaries. So they had plastic frames, and they laid them out from the boundaries and towards both sides, and examined these little plots and looked at what species occur there, and sampled the soil and analyzed it, and so on and so on. And they produced an extremely nice work showing what the effect is and what happens in the soil if you see the change in species on top. The one grade and the one boundary between the saline plots with this Mesembrantumum fastigiatum and the Orisia butoni, the acidic quartz fields, there we could show that soil pH was the main driver. So soil pH was here neutral, and then it dropped rapidly at the boundary, and then it was at about pH 4. At the same time, the density, the abundance of this annual mesem dropped and remained low, whereas the abundance of this Orisia here, the pink, pink color, it increased from the boundary. The increase is much lower because that species is much bigger, and there's less. The plots are small, so there are less of these plants fit into one of these plots, but the principle is the same. So there's an increase, a decrease of the one, and the increase of the other. So there are also boundaries between quartz fields and the zonal vegetation. Again, sharp boundaries, two different dominant species. On the one hand here, Agroderma fissum and Cephalophyllum spissum on quartz, and Orisia bolusi at the other side on the zonal vegetation. And here again, saline quartz fields, pH at 6, salinity at 3, and here salinity at 1. And the soil pH was slightly higher than on the acidic, on the saline quartz fields. Again, they looked at the boundary and what happens there. And here we found salinity to drop within a meter drastically and remain low in the zonal vegetation. Then also the abundance of the two species decrease towards the boundary quite sharply. And the green line is the Orisia, the abundance or the number of individuals of this Orisia increases on the right-hand side of the boundary. So the study showed that the sharp boundaries between the plant communities within the quartz fields and between quartz fields and their surrounding zonal vegetation are driven by abrupt changes in soil conditions. And that And the species composition is closely coupled with this condition. And so if we look at this, then we can assume that if we go from here to there, there's a change in soil condition. If we go from here to there, the soil then change in soil condition, and the vegetation reflects that in the composition of species. So if I summarize or simplify maybe even the findings of the soil conditions on quartz, I can summarize it like that. If I compare the zonal soils with the saline quartz fields and the acidic quartz fields as the two extremes of the quartz fields, then I found quartz fields have quartz cover fair enough, but this is of small to medium-sized stones on the saline quartz fields and more coarse stones on the acidic quartz fields. Soil depth is comparatively deep for the area in the zonal soils, but shallow on quartz. Stone content is low on zonal soils. Saline soils have also relatively little stone content, whereas acidic quartz fields are typically more rocky. The soil, stony. Salinity is low in quartz fields, but high obviously on saline quartz fields, but also low on acidic quartz fields. And the soil pH is acidic on quartz fields, but more or less neutral on the saline and the zonal soils. So there's actually quite a few factors that differ between all three types. What the quartz fields have in common is that they're both more shallow than the zonal soils. They either have a high stone content, which allows for less water storage because of less pore volume to store water than in the other soils. So they either have little storage for water, or they're very saline. So the plants that grow on this type of soil have to take up the salinity against the osmolarity of the soil. And additionally, the acidic quartz fields have a very low soil pH, which results in that plant toxic ions like aluminium are more mobile than in neutral in other soils. They're normally fixed in these soils, but get mobilized by low soil pH. So quartz fields, in many ways, they're either very dry habitats, arid habitats, but they're also, with regard to salinity, another challenge to have the high salinity is obviously also plant toxic, not only because of the osmolarity, because of sodium and chloride is also plant toxic in high concentrations, and the acidic soils are toxic due to the aluminium and other ions that get mobilized. So in the nutshell, soils of the quartz fields provide challenging growing conditions for plants. And this is why they don't grow into the sky, where they're very tiny and on quartz, and compared to the more shrubby, slightly taller life forms, even in the Knäsflagte. So we can summarize that the dominance of dwarf growth forms on quartz fields can be interpreted as an adaptation to the soil condition that provide a higher aridity than their surrounding. All right, so being small is an advantage. By having less biomass that needs to be supplied with water, and less surface area or lower surface area through which or by which the humidity, the water gets lost to the surrounding air. So with other words, the plants can live on very little water and other resources if they're tiny. They can also benefit, because they need so little, they can also benefit and utilize the little water resources that are provided by the water droplets that run down the leaves and penetrate the soil. And because these plants have very shallow roots, they can make direct use of this type of resource. But this is only of benefit if that little resource is already makes already a difference to you. The shallow roots can also utilize the humidity, the soil humidity that condenses under the lower surface of stones. So this is one of these quartz stones that I lifted up. And if I could have lifted up any of the others of the right size, so it shouldn't be too small, so that enough water can get caught, and you will find this green layer of green algae that grow and live underneath, and they benefit from the humidity that condenses there. And the same is for the succulents that grow on the quartz and are tiny and have shallow roots. So, considering the previous arguments, it seems like a great strategy to be tiny if one grows in arid areas in general, or at least in winter rainfall regions, because the winter rainfall, as I said at the beginning, characterized by very low but comparatively reliable rainfall. So, and one could wonder why we don't find dwarf succulents to dominate the vegetation in many more habitats in the winter rainfall region. And the answer, one of the reasons, is that the benefit of being small comes with a price. To be small and close to the soil surface also means to sit at the hottest spot of the environment. The solar radiation heats up the soil surface and warms up the surface, and the surface again emits the heat and which warms up the soil layer next to the soil surface, the air layer next to the soil surface. And the dwarf succulents therefore sit exactly where the air is hottest. Whereas the shrubs here, they reach far above it. They can even cast shade on their own rooting area. So they are fine, but they don't even feel this type of this heat. But the succulent, the dwarf succulents, in the first layer of 1 centimeter or so above soil surface, they sit where it's hottest. And I did a study and measured the soil temperature, and the soil temperature here near the soil surface can reach 56 degrees during a hot summer day, whereas in the ambient temperature, which is 2 meters above soil surface, was only 38. So that makes a big difference. However, if the soil surface is covered by quartz stones, by the white quartz stones that have a high albedo and reflect more of the radiation than they actually store the radiation, they emit much, or they get less hot, they emit less heat, and therefore the air temperature near the ground on quartz fields is lower. And I compared that at the same day, and so it was on the quartz fields, it was, instead of 56, it was 46, so it's 10 degrees cooler. And still it is 38 degrees, 2 meters above the soil surface, so it's still hotter near the ground, but the temperature is it's less extreme. So the daily maximum temperature on the air near the ground are cooler on quartz fields, and that seems to have a moderating effect on the temperature condition of the growth forms near the ground. But yet, quartz these dwarf plants, they live quite close to the surface and they are exposed to higher temperature than their other fellows, neighbor fellows here that are much taller. So even though the temperature near the ground is cooler on quartz than outside on bare soil, the temperatures are still hotter than about, for instance, 20 centimeters above the soil or 2 meters above the soil surface. And the high temperatures are a challenge for plants, particularly if they don't have access to water to produce evaporative cooling. So the question arises, how will the plants cope under climate change? And we did a little experiment many years back with a colleague from Sandby and Cape Kirstenbosch, Charles Musel, and he put out these plastic chambers to produce passive warming. So he warmed up the plants during one summer, and he put them up in different plant communities here on Agroderma pecunia, Spissum, and Rosanthemum diversifolia, or Russia butuni. So they were not only different species, but also different growth forms, very tiny ones to more shrubby ones. And so that's how it looked like in the Knausflachte in the study area during a nice foggy day. But it wasn't always that foggy, but it also became hot. And during these, you can see it's already 20 years back, when we did this, so during that summer, we measured the temperature inside the chamber and saw that it ranged the temperature increase or enhancement compared to the ambient air was about 4 to 7 degrees, depending on where it is. So if you can imagine here, if the sun comes from north and hits the soil surface here, then it gets much hotter in the southern part of the chamber than here, where also the plastic chamber casts a bit of or protects, or casts a bit of shadow and shade and protects a bit of the plants from the radiation. So it makes a bit of a difference in temperature. So after one summer where the plants were kept like that, and obviously we also had control plots where they were not warmed, we looked at the effect. And what we found was that the shrubby plants, we looked at how many plants died over the summer, and the shrubby plants effect is not the low shrubs, the Drosanthemum, there was no effect. But if we looked at the Cephalophyllum spissum, that's compact with long leaves, and Agroderma with a very compact, very round leaves, we had a much higher mortality in these heated chambers than in the control. And we also looked at the canopy mortality, so how many of the leaves, or how much percentage of the leaves that died. Again, tall ruchias didn't show any effects, but there even the smaller shrubs showed a negative effect by the open top chambers or the warming. Cephalophyllum as well. And for Agroderma, it was difficult to say canopy mortality because that was in the plant that only has 2 leaves. That means the plant dies anyway. So that actually what one can say is that the smaller the plants, the higher the mortality of them. And that's because they're most likely because they're closest to the hot surface. So, and the plants only survived where they were situated in a cooler, ventilated areas next to the edge of the open top chambers, like here. Or here underneath other shrubs, but in the open area, they all died. So that might give us an idea of how plants, how close they're already at the threshold of what they can actually deal with. And in temperature increase, this was quite a drastic increase of several degrees, but still that already led to strong dieback of plants. There is no doubt that temperature will further increase with climate change. All projections support that fully. And the most recent IPCC report has just been published. But what we less understand, or understand it less well, is how the rainfall pattern will change in that region. And this is much more difficult to project because the rainfall is erratic and very variable anyway. And it's likely, though, that the rainfall will become more erratic and extensive droughts will become more frequent. And we can get a taste of that effect, or we could get we got the taste of the effect of extensive droughts based on the droughts of the recent years. And that is here, the graph shows you the rainfall in the Knetzlekte per year, and that's the long-term average or long-term mean. And it shows that the last years up to 2019, it was below long-term, far below long-term mean. And already extensive extreme drought, even the shrubs here, Fuchsia, many of them died, and Cephalophyllum spissum, many of them died. And I mean, we can assume that the population can recover if the drought is broken and it rains. If there's several years of good rainfall, then they most likely will regenerate from the seed. So far, so good. But it's likely that the next, under climate change, we will have recurrent droughts, and the question is how often these populations actually can make it. And together with the increasing temperatures. So the question is, what can we do to mitigate the effects on the succulents? And I think there are many things, several things that we can do, besides what we as humans can do anyway, to try to reduce the greenhouse gas release. So there's a little contribution that all of us can do. But besides that, there is the things that we as the society or humanity should consider. And that is, we should certainly reduce the effect of other pressures on the plants in order to provide as many as possible natural habitats for the plants and animals to survive. And one of the points is, for instance, that we should reduce the pressure of livestock grazing on the vegetation. And overgrazing and trampling adds to additional pressure on the plants and may destroy populations that had the potential to survive and produce seeds for other sites as well. We should also definitely stop destroying precious habitats, like here in the Gamsberg in the Bushmanland, where habitats of rare and endangered succulents on top of that mountain are transformed into a mine for lead and zinc. And just for you to get an idea of the dimension, this is one of these big mining tipping trucks that the mines use to throw the overburden over the mountain, as they do here nicely. That's how it looks like on top of the mountain. It's a whole landscape transformation. They adjust the mountain to what they need for their purpose. And that mine has a projected lifetime of 30 years or so. For 30 years of mining lead and zinc, entire landscape is destroyed and populations might get extinct. Another project is the Buhobei port, which is a railway and infrastructure project in the Richtersveld, in one of the most species-rich and endemic-rich areas in South Africa. And here, a big area will be transformed into an industrial area with a big harbor. Not to mention all the infrastructure that goes with it, and people's housing, transport, and so on and so on. So this is what we need to prevent, or we should prevent, in order to ensure that we give our plants some chance to survive. Another aspect that we should look at is that we should put an end to the poaching of plants, and mostly of succulents, and our beloved Mesembs are the targets for that. This photo, for instance, shows South African police officers with boxes of confiscated plants, and these plants, even if confiscated, are unfortunately forever lost from the environment. We can't plant them back, and we as it is at the moment, and we can discuss later why that is. So what can we do among people that live in the area, that live with the plants, and show them the treasure in front of their doorsteps, so that they learn to appreciate their beauty and value in their natural environment. And not saying that people don't do that, but particularly the upcoming generation that grows up in different situations than their parents maybe, and their grandparents, and have different relations to nature, they need to get taught and exposed to nature in order to understand and to appreciate it. We can also be being part of a community of succulent lovers. We can raise awareness for the threat of illegal collection that causes destruction of our great biodiversity. And we have to make aware that the collecting and trafficking of or buying of poached plants is an act of crime. It's morally and legally. These photos are from Cape Nature in South Africa. They confiscate thousands and thousands. That's actually not, but they confiscate thousands and thousands of plants nearly at the daily basis, and you wonder where they still come from. And so my final slide shows the golden flowers of Hylobolus abbreviatus and Mesembrantumum liliputanum here. This Hylobolus or Mesembrantum, and the Oophytum, which is the pink flower here on the quartz, and it gives an idea of the harshness, but also of the fragility and beauty of the quartz field habitat and its plants. So let's appreciate and let's protect it. And with this, I would like to thank people and organizations. And I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Doctor. You wouldn't have heard it, but there was applause at the end there. So thank you very much for the absolutely fascinating talk. I'm going to see if there are any questions from the class. We have one question.
Speak so that they can see me on the.
Yes. So Harty is coming over to ask a question here.
Danke, Ute, ist richtig schön von dir. One question, if you look at the pictures, many of the pictures have quartz pebbles on the surface, but below that is a very different kind of material that's not quartzitic. What are we dealing as a substrate? And that must be very different in nature in the characteristics to the quartz itself. And along that line, is the salinity of the soil a reflection of the degradation of that subsoil, or is it more the history or the origin of the sand itself, say alluvial or whatever? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because many people tend to believe that quartz plants grow on quartz sand or something. That's just not the case. You're right, it's two different things. The story behind it is that the quartz of the quartz fields originates from quartz veins, which are embedded into more shale-like geology. So we call it phyllite. It's very soft, but it's like shale, it's in layers and so on, but it's very soft and weathers much quicker and before the quartz weathers. So first of all, the shale weathers away, and then we get the quartz veins sticking out, and then they start disintegrating and distributing, following the gravity across the landscape. That's also why we have the bigger stones at the more near to the outcrop, which is also more the acidic or less saline area, and then the fine stones that are furthest away, which is in the flat area, which is where the saline quartz fields are. And this sorting can be very fine scale. So it's not only one source of quartz and then at the very end, a few 100 meters away, there's the end of the quartz field, and that's where the saline soil is. Now it's quite a fine scale thing because of the microtopography. Now the question where the salinity or the salt comes from, it is not a question of degradation or something like that. So it's original condition without any impact or effect of human activity. The plants are highly adapted to it. It's a horizontal transport of salt to a certain extent. So if we have slope, then obviously that is a run-off area where the water, if it runs down, and also in the winter rainfall areas, there's some runoff. If it percolates down or through the soil, it percolates into the lower lying area, with it some dissolved salt from the water, from the soil. So that gets transported in the flat areas. That's where it sits, and then it percolates into the soil, then it evaporates and it gets to the surface again, and so on and so on. So it is there's some vertical transport, but there's also horizontal transport in very small scale. So that's why we have accumulation of salt in some areas that comes from the geology in situ situation, and then you have the situation where it's more run off, and the salt is taken away and leached, so to say, and then you have areas where you have accumulation of salt. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Is that shale? Is that it's close to clay, or is it more sandstone in consistency?
It's not clay. It is more silty, sandy salt. So it's not very heavy soil. It's silty, so it's fine, very fine structured, but not as clay. And it gets also very soft. That's why we should never walk on quartz fields if it rained heavily, because the tracks that we leave behind will last for quite a while and it's quite destructive. While we can well walk on the quartz fields if it's dry. So it is actually lateral transport and reallocation of salt that leads to the different patterns of salinity, and it's the salt that comes out of the geology or out of the rocks that weathers, and obviously also certainly also from the environment, from the sea and so on, but it's it's transported laterally and accumulated at certain areas.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, Lulu.
Yeah, and my question is twofold. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is twofold. First of all, if you are so knowledgeable about which plants grow on which quartz fields and where on which quartz fields, why can they not be reintroduced into the wild? The poached ones, I mean, the ones that have been pinched. And secondly, I believe that this year, Kirstenbosch has been receiving 5,000 plants a week. I don't know, or even more than that, that have been stolen. They have to look after them. How does one do that if one can't mimic the original environment? And then thirdly, what happens to those plants? What are they going to do with them in the end?
Yeah, it is a tragedy of a huge dimension. I always say what climate change doesn't manage, humans do now. Yeah, so to answer the question, the question is actually, the answer is why they can't be transplanted is because the species are not only very localized, but within their localized distribution, they're also very heterogeneous in terms of their genes. So there's small scale, within their small distribution area, they have very fine patterns of the genetic patterns. So if we don't know the patterns and we just transplant them randomly where we think they fit or where there's space or where we can reach, then we might mess up the genetic pattern. And by that, we decrease the chances of the plants to cope, because they are well adapted to that particular their particular habitats, and by that genetically unique for that area. If we mess up and if we mix it up by planting plants from different populations among them, then we might decrease the chances of the plants to cope with these harsh conditions at that particular area. So there were transplant experiments, for instance, by Alan Ellis from Stellenbosch University many years back for his PhD. And he realized that even the same species, he transplanted plants of the same species by different populations. And the plants that were transplanted into a different population had a poorer chance to survive than the plants transplanted, they just transplanted within the same population in order to exclude the effect of transplanting. So they are better adapted to their own habitat than to other habitats, even at the same species. And so what we try to do now is one of the, maybe the answers also to your question, is we try to understand or analyze the plant population genetics of the plants in order to better understand how diverse it is, how heterogeneous it is, and then to transplant the plants back, hopefully in the near future, to the right habitat and to the right population. But that is it's time intensive and it's obviously expensive to do that. But we try now to start off with a pilot project to understand the genetic patterns. We already know for one species, for instance, Conophytocalculus, so as far as we know, there it wouldn't matter because they're not very distinct. So they're more or less one thing in the Knaslacta. So there we could just transplant. But others, we know it's quite distinct and it would be wrong to plant plants among them just randomly because we might decrease the fitness of the plants by the population by that. And what else to do with the plants? It's horrible. I mean, I discussed that with the Knaslacta colleagues. It's always the question of, do we have the chance of destroying them? letting them further dry in the boxes because we don't know what to do. We have the chance of we have the option to just planting them out, but we know it's wrong. So it's a bit like none of the options are feasible or recommendable. And or the other idea is to swamp the market with it, and because they're now out anyway, and then trade them legally. And but that's also difficult to do. Yeah, I think that what we need is we need to raise awareness in the community, but with the economic situation that most of the people are in, the awareness might be there, but if they don't know how to buy food, then it's very difficult to convince them not to steal the plants. Or to study the genetics of the plants that are and understand them, and then be able to plant them out in the right population. And that also allows us to identify where the plants have been collected, so we know where the people moved around. That's also not something that sometimes we don't even know what region the plants are from. If they get confiscated in the Knersleck, they can well be from the Richtersveld. We don't know.
And what do the people in Kirstenbosch do with these plants? Are they able to keep them alive, or what do they do?
We should go to what is this soon.
They keep them. For the time being, they keep them, and they try to maybe from there keep the populations alive, propagate from there. But it's also, yeah, the seedlings from these plants are also difficult to plant back, because then they are also already mixed, certainly. So, yeah, it's very difficult. I think the only thing that we can do is understand the population genetics and then transplant them and make sure they don't get stolen again. I mean, chances that they get stolen again are quite big if we just plant them out again.
Thank you very much. So there's a question from the chat here, which is from Shahir, who's asked if there was any analysis done on mineral composition, and particularly looking at the percentage makeup of the particular minerals that are in the soil.
Mineral composition, yeah. There is a study looking at the total element composition, and so that is just analyzing the stone, the content of the geology, like making them fine and analyzing what's in there without necessarily having the composition that plants actually get, because it's what plant get or what plant take up from the soil is only what is water soluble. So what is what is already weathered out and is resolves in the water if it rains. So that we know. No, not all of it, but I mean the most important, or what we assume is important, ions, plant available ions and nutrients and salt ions that have an effect on the plants. Yeah, sodium chloride is in most, it's the biggest component. Sulfate is in there, potassium, and then you get if you analyze the total component, the total element component of the stones, then it's obviously many more. There is information on that, and it's even published. If you're interested, I can send you. It's published in a different context. We did germination experiments on these soils with the plants, and we also looked at the ions and the elements and so on.
Super, thank you. Yeah, we'd love to get that if it's available to you and if you're able to share it. I'll see if there are any other questions. I have one more. Sorry, Michael, yes.
Well, I've got a very small question. In several visits to the Richtersveld, mainly in August or September, I've seen a plant which I've been unable to identify, but I suspect that it's a cephalophyllum. It's a mesem, forms a quite an extensive shrub, and it has bright crimson flowers, quite large. And I think I've seen the same plant flowering in the more arid areas around Nieuwoudt. So it's fairly widespread. Robust rounded leaves and these very strong crimson flowers, which are quite striking. So when you mentioned Cephalophyllum spicum, I wondered if that was perhaps the plant I was looking for.
Did you get all that, Doctor?
It was a bit difficult, but I think if you're looking for a plant that also occurs on at Nieuwoudt and even further east, then Cephalophyllum spicum would not be among them, because Cephalophyllum spicum is only Knaerslakte. It's a Knaerslakte endemic. So if it looks like Cephalophyllum spicum, then it might be another Cephalophyllum or a Chirodopsis.
Chirodopsis. No, it didn't look like Chirodopsis.
Yeah, but sorry, then the only thing that I can tell you that Cephalophyllum spicum is only Knaerslakte.
Not being a botanist, it's very, very difficult when one encounters a plant one doesn't know.
Yes, iNaturalist, if you upload it to iNaturalist, you might be helped.
Yeah, of course.
No.
Thank you.
But
Send you
yeah.
a photograph.
Thank you.
Can we
Yes.
send you a photograph of it, or several photographs?
Sorry, Lulu's asked if she could send you a photograph of it, and if you wouldn't mind looking at it when you have some time.
I don't mind. I might get down to so it's Nieuwoudt and where else?
And on the Richtersveld.
Richtersveld. Yeah.
Not Richtersveld,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
You're welcome to send me the photo. I can't promise that I identify it, because the Richtersveld is a world by itself, and I'm not a Richtersveld specialist, but if I know it, I'm happy to, at least maybe I can help you with, most likely I can help you with the genus.
That was a slip of the tongue. It wasn't Richtersveld. It was Knaerslakte.
Knaerslakte is a good guess, then I can help you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question that I have is on the back of a meeting that we had last month, which was with Mike Viviers, who's one of the horticulturalists at one of the great indigenous nurseries that we have nearby. And he was talking about soil compositions, and in particular compositions for collections. But one of the points that he's brought up previously is about the mycorrhiza, so the fungal content of the soil. And he said that about 90% of plants on Earth are obligate, have obligate transactionary relationships with fungus, and in particular mycorrhiza. Do you know of any, this might just be a yes or no answer, do you know of any studies that have been done into the mycorrhiza of the Knaerslakte?
No, I don't know. And all I can say is that we did germination trials. We're a bit on that, we try that, but more indirectly. We do experiments on that. So we have germination experiments with plants growing on their own soil and soils of other population or other, not population, but other species, where other species occur, but not them, and horticultural standard substrate. And I can tell you, they're all happy to grow to quite a high percentage on the horticultural substrate, and they struggle to germinate even on their own soil.
Wow.
So it is, and most of the mesembs are happy to germinate. I mean, if you know how to do it, they germinate on wherever and grow happily on horticultural substrate, because they're not. They can cope, and if they have to, they can cope with the conditions, but they don't necessarily require that. So we grow them all in nurseries on whatever soil, as long as the soil is gentle to them. But but they can, that their speciality is that they can also cope on their own soil.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. We've got another question from Lulu.
So my question is, if so many of these little dwarfs are happy to grow in ordinary horticultural substrate, why are so many of them obligate quartz field growers? Why do you find so many of them only in quartz fields and nowhere else in the entire set of ecosystems that you could find on the west side of our country, if they're so happy to grow in ordinary horticultural soil?
That's a good question. First of all, I think there are many more species that are habited or somehow specialized on their on different soil types. So even outside the quartz fields, we find quite distinct patterns in vegetation, but not as drastic or not as clear cut as on quartz hill. And I guess one factor is that we shouldn't forget is the competition. I guess most of the plants would also grow on the zonal soil if they could, if they don't get out-competed. And maybe if the soil would be a bit more stable. I think the stabilization of the quartz cover, or by the quartz cover, the stabilization of the soil surface by a quartz cover should not be underestimated. I think that's quite important as well. But and then in addition, then it comes the competition. And so they grow there because they can grow there, and hardly anything else can grow there. But it's exactly, that's the question what we asked when we did this germination trials, and I was completely confused when I realized that they don't grow even on their own soil, very poorly. And it could be that maybe it has something to do with the mycorrhiza, because we also they treated the soil first, because we didn't want to have all sorts of seedlings in there. We only used the one that we sowed. It could be. But at the moment we run a trial with lithops seeds, where we have different soils and which are partly treated and partly not. So the soil is partly treated, partly not. So maybe, but that's at the very beginning. So we don't know yet what the outcome would be of that one. And so maybe that will tell us that it's actually steamed, the soil. So the steaming of the soil might have an effect on the mycorrhiza, and that's why the plants cope so well on that. There are many interesting topics that still need to be studied to understand this miracle of quartz field vegetation.
Are there any more questions? Awesome. Thank you, Doctor. We're out of questions here. I think that your talk was very inclusive and really covered most of the bland questions that we had, because for all of us in Joburg, this is quite an alien landscape. Somewhat as alien as it is for you. I mean, I've never been to the Knaashvlakte, and it's only a day away. So thank you very much. I think that was absolutely awesome. We really appreciate you making the time to fly out to Joburg via the internet. And we look forward to hearing more. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thanks again for the invitation and your interest. And yeah, I'm happy to whenever talk again. Then I would send you the paper about the germination trials, right, Keith? And then you will
Thank you. Absolutely.
forward it to, or whatever. I will send it to you and maybe Lulu, and you will send it around.
Get it to where it needs to be. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Then I wish you all a good evening and yeah, and hope to see you again.
Yes, thank you. And to you too.
Okay. Bye.
Super. Bye.
Bye.